During World War II, we had men stationed on some islands outside of Alaska, and they were there to keep an eye on the Russians, basically. And they were resupplied. They were on a remote island, and they were resupplied by boats. Somebody realized that maybe if the weather was bad, the boats wouldn't get there, and the resupply wouldn't occur, and so they'd run out of food. And so somebody else said, well, let's put some reindeer on the island. The reindeer will reproduce, and if the boats are unable to get there with the food, the soldiers can slaughter the reindeer and eat the reindeer meat. And that was fine, and the war ended, and we left. And at the time, there were a couple hundred reindeer hanging around. And the reindeer didn't have any natural predators. There were no wolves or anything to kill them. And what they did was they ate the moss and the lichen that grew on the island, and that kept them alive. Well, over time, they reproduced, as reindeer will, and the number of reindeer grew steadily from starting at 22 up to 6,000 reindeer in the early 1960s. And then at that point in time, the food that was there just did not support the reindeer that were there, and they had a very bad winter, and a lot of the lichen got covered up, and they all died. Within the space of a year, the head count went from 6,000 reindeer to 42 reindeer.
It's a sad story.
It's a very sad story for the reindeer, obviously, but the point being that what happened there is they outstripped their resources. They outgrew their resources. And, if the reindeer had productivity-enhancing developments where they could have, grown lichen artificially inside of greenhouses and so on,
of course,
they might have been able to support 12,000 reindeer. Who knows? But they reached the point at which the carrying capacity exceeded the system. And that's the point. If you take Keynesianism to its natural extension of just growth at any cost, eventually you're going to outgrow your ability to supply yourself. And in fact, it actually applies to debt, Stein's law, which says that if something can't go on forever, it will end. And what's been going on forever is that debt has been growing, and it's been growing at a faster rate than GDP. And the GDP, when you take on debt, you have to pay interest, and then in theory you pay the principal back or you roll it over. The GDP is what you use to do that with because you have to earn money to pay the interest. And if the GDP does not grow at the same rate that the debt grows at, eventually you outstrip your ability to pay the interest. And the debt either fails or you need to heavily inflate the GDP in order to catch up. If something cannot go on forever, it will end.
Welcome back to another episode of Cypherpunk'd. I'm joined by my friend Larry Lepard today, and we're going to dive into episode 6 of our series on his book, The Big Print. We're going to talk about Keynesians, modern monetary theory, Austrian economics, and all sorts of other stuff. we might even touch on the St. Matthew Island reindeer population. But that being said, let's dive in here. I'm going to read a quote or something you wrote that I really liked to open this chapter. Should governments intervene in markets or let them run free? Is saving virtuous or harmful? Can prosperity be printed? The answers to these questions have profound implications for our future. I love that.
Yeah, they really do. I mean, we're using the wrong model.
Could you please bring the mic closer?
We gotta get mic.
Yeah, really, really great questions. We're using the wrong model. We're using a Keynesian model. I can define if you like, but it basically says, I think we've talked about this a little bit in other episodes, but it basically says that the government should intervene when deflation or a slow economy appears to be taking place. And spend money, often money they don't have, borrowed, to stimulate what John Maynard Keynes called animal spirits and get demand going and get the cycle to be a positive cycle. And my belief is that business cycles are actually natural and healthy. You have an upswing, you have a downturn, and the downturns are generally self-correcting of the upswing. And if the upswing wasn't too egregious, if there wasn't a credit bubble, having a slowdown is fine. It's like creative destruction.
Yeah, it's healthy.
It's healthy, yeah.
It really is telling that the whole idea of Keynesian economics is like this idea that punishes saving. It disincentivizes it.
Yes.
It kind of, if you look at our society today, monetary policy, all of these things have profound cultural impacts on the way people behave.
Yes.
And how right now everything is spend, buy, show. Right. It's like it's eroded our culture in ways that are hard to even, for most people to even comprehend, I think personally. And I wanted to read this quote from Paul Samuelson, who is one of the leading Keynesian economics of the past 100 years. And this guy apparently literally wrote textbooks about economic education in the post-war era. But he said, after World War II, he said, the final conclusion to be drawn from our experience at the end of the last war is inescapable. Were the war to end suddenly within the next 6 months, were we again painlessly to wind up our war effort in the greatest haste, to demobilize our armed forces, to liquidate price controls, to shift from astronomical deficits to even the larger deficits of the 30s, then there would be ushered in the greatest period of unemployment and industrial dislocation which an economy has ever faced.
Yeah, it's
probably one of the worst predictions.
One of the all-time,
aside from Paul Krugman.
One of the all-time bad calls, right? Because what happened is when World War II ended and we demobilized and we stopped building tanks, we started building cars.
And we stopped price controls and we let the economy
just
normal.
do its normal thing. And all those GIs came back and they bought cars and houses and appliances and the economy grew. Now the demographics were better then than they are today.
Of course.
But economies adjust very naturally and in a way that they should without the government being involved.
Yeah.
And that's lost on Keynesian.
The U.S. government cut its spending by an astonishing 75% between 1944 and 1948, and it also removed most price controls for good measure. And yet the U.S. economy witnessed an extraordinary boom during these years. Right. The exact opposite of what a leading Keynesian predicted is what occurred.
That's exactly right.
And I think, us Austrian economists would have easily called that.
Right.
One thing I want to, before we go to magic money printing monetary theory, I want to touch on one thing about classical economics. I know we kind of talked about it before, but this idea of supply and demand, the invisible hand, and laissez-faire free trade was this law called Say's law. Say's law, which posits that the production of one product creates demand for another by producing something of value that can be exchanged for that other product. Or more simply, production creates its own demand. That was trying to think of what that was when we talked about it yesterday or the other day when we recorded the other episode. Was this idea that it's not a zero-sum game. No. That when stuff is happening, it's going to create new products, new ideas, new businesses, new inventions, things that you couldn't possibly imagine.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. And then the theory of comparative advantage, which I think is also a very important idea to explain how nations would prosper through specialization in trade. These thinkers laid the groundwork for what would later become the Austrian School of Economics. So Austrian School is built atop the classical
school.
Exactly.
Right. And what the classical school was, they actually held the view that the price of products was a function of the labor input into those products. And that wasn't entirely wrong. Mm-hmm. But what Menger did when he came along with the Austrian School and founded the Austrian School was he posited that really value is a relative thing. Yeah. And it's based on the mind of the consumer.
Exactly.
And, the first beer is more valuable to you than the 10th beer.
Exactly. This idea of, if you're in a desert, you'll pay way more for a bottle of water.
Right. Water is generally free if you're standing next to a pump.
Yeah, exactly.
It's producing a lot of water. But if you're in the Sahara and if somebody has water and they want to sell it to you, you'll pay almost anything for it. Yeah. And so relative value is a function of what the market determines it to be, and it's based on consumer preferences and choices. That was the biggest opening insight of the Austrian School. And it said that the marketplace really is the decider of all economics. And that's why, Menger and the Austrians came to believe that gold and silver were really the best forms of money because the market had told them that.
Yeah.
Everything was transacted in gold and silver and they were sound. They didn't change in value. And so, they came to that conclusion and it was an earthquake really in the economics field. And some people wanted to adopt it and believe in it. But others, the Keynesians, generally fought against it. They didn't like that. They thought that the money and the monetary theory people, who we'll talk about in a minute, and they're really nut jobs, but they kind of thought, no. Money is not what the market says it is. Money is what the government says it is. and obviously that's
what if I told you that there was this super sound money that's been designed perfectly to be the best kind of money that over the course of almost 2 decades now has been the best performing asset in all of human history? What if I told you there was a money like that? What would you think?
I would have some interest in that money. I would think to myself, wow, that's pretty interesting. And maybe that's something I should own.
Yeah. You wouldn't think it's rat poison squared or...
No, not.
some of these other things
Yeah.
Bill Gates and these other guys have said. So, as you can imagine, Keynes was an enemy of sound money and often referred to the gold standard as a barbarous relic.
Right.
Although he had some insights later on where he was with Bancor and all that, he kind of seemed maybe he'd come about circle a little bit.
A little bit. I mean, he wasn't a dumb man.
Yeah.
He understood the situation pretty well.
Of course, Keynes, this is another funny one. He was a favorite of the government, loved Keynes, right?
Of course they did. Well, he was a statist.
Statist, yeah.
He was a socialist too. He was a Fabian socialist in Britain. The government loved him because he gave the government power.
Yeah.
Right.
It's funny how that works.
Yeah, right.
It's kind of funny how that works.
Yeah, and in turn, the government gave him prestige and made him I think I remember reading an article in Britain where they called him the world's greatest economist.
Yeah. And I think, examining history, it's obvious if you look at history that the Austrian economic model has proven to be much more accurate and predictive.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, but it's ignored because the conclusions that it draws are very inconvenient for the Keynesian academics and for government ministers.
This is when he uttered his famous quote that you've put in his book. In the long run, we are all dead.
Right. So and that came out of somebody questioned him and said, "But sir, if we follow those policies, eventually in the long run, this cannot continue. We can't continue to spend more than we bring in." And he said, "Yes, sir, but in the long run, we're all dead," which to me was just an evil statement.
Von Mises' response to this: for the demagogue does not bother about the remoter consequences of his policies. He chooses inflation and credit expansion, although he knows that the boom they create is short-lived and must inevitably end in a slump. He may even boast of his neglect of the long-run effects. In the long run, he repeats, we are all dead. It is only the short run that counts.
Right. So, von Mises took a very nice swipe at Keynes there, and deservedly so.
Deservedly so. You're not wrong. So this was a cool little thing you added in the book about this, the St. Matthew Island reindeer population.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. So people have to refer to the book to see it. It's on page 157. But the notion, just think about, it's fun when you're looking at economic concepts or any concept in general, just take them to the extreme.
Yeah.
Okay. So the notion that growth is good, that we should just get bigger and bigger and bigger in everything, and that represents prosperity and that's good. That's somewhat conflicted by the fact that we live on a fixed size planet with a fixed amount of resources. And so if you assume that growth is good, you might outgrow your resources if you don't have productivity growth. And a perfect example of that is demonstrated in this case study that occurred in Alaska after World War II. So in Alaska, during World War II, we had men stationed on some islands outside of Alaska, and they were there to keep an eye on the Russians, basically. And they were resupplied. They were on a remote island, and they were resupplied by boats. And somebody realized that maybe if the weather was bad, the boats wouldn't get there, and the resupply wouldn't occur, and so they'd run out of food. And so somebody else said, well, let's put some reindeer on the island, and the reindeer will reproduce. And if the boats are unable to get there with the food, the soldiers can slaughter the reindeer and eat the reindeer meat. And that was fine. And the war ended, and we left. And at the time, there were a couple hundred reindeer hanging around, and the reindeer didn't have any natural predators. There were no wolves or anything to kill them. And what they did was they ate the moss and the lichen that grew on the island, and that kept them alive. Well, over time, they reproduced, as reindeer will, and the number of reindeer grew steadily from starting at 22 up to 6,000 reindeer in the early 1960s. And then at that point in time, the food that was there just did not support the reindeer that were there, and they had a very bad winter, and a lot of the lichen got covered up, and they all died.
Oh, man.
Within the space of a year, the head count went from 6,000 reindeer to 42 reindeer.
That's a sad story.
It's a very sad story for the reindeer, obviously, but the point being that what happened there is they outstripped their resources. They outgrew their resources. And, if the reindeer had productivity-enhancing developments where they could have, grown lichen artificially inside of greenhouses and so on,
of course,
they might have been able to support 12,000 reindeer. Who knows? But they reached the point at which the carrying capacity exceeded the system. And that's the point. If you take Keynesianism to its natural extension of just growth at any cost, eventually you're going to outgrow your ability to supply yourself. And in fact, it actually applies to debt. And it's part of what we're going to, I think, talk about next, which is Stein's law, which says that if something can't go on forever, it will end. And what's been going on forever is that GDP has been growing, debt has been growing, and it's been growing at a faster rate than GDP. And the GDP, when you take on debt, you have to pay interest, and then in theory, you pay the principal back or you roll it over.
Yeah.
The GDP is what you use to do that with because you have to earn money to pay the interest. And if the GDP does not grow at the same rate that the debt grows at, eventually you outstrip your ability to pay the interest. And the debt either fails or you need to heavily inflate the GDP in order to catch up.
Yeah, I mean, just think about it. If it's a household, right? Like, you've got 100,000 coming in per year, but if your monthly payment is 10,500, you're not going to.
This is a perfect comparable to this are those families who take out new credit cards to pay the old credit cards.
Yeah.
And eventually, one of the credit card companies realizes, you know what, we're not giving you a new one.
Yeah.
And you don't have the new source of funds to pay for the old, and you collapse.
Yeah. This takes us to our next your favorite type of economic policy, modern monetary theory.
Yeah.
I know you love this so much.
I do. Yeah. Stephanie Kelton is a very high profile woman who wrote a book about this, and I mean, to me, this is just a jump into monetary delusion. She has rebranded the old George Knapp chartalism policy that led to the hyperinflation in Weimar Germany. What does that mean? Modern monetary theorist, she says government deficits are not a problem because we owe them to ourselves, and no government can ever run out of money as long as it has a printing press. And so her theory and point is that this whole notion of taking out debt and then having a deficit to, and then borrowing more to make the debt bigger, she's like, ignore all of that. We should just print the money and pay the debt off. And if we run deficits, we can print the money to pay for those deficits as well. And that's all fine and good, except that in so doing, you're going to print so much money that you're going to destroy the purchasing power and the value of the currency, which is what happened in Weimar Germany. Now, to be fair to her, she concedes that inflation is a risk with her policy. She does concede that, so that's, I'm trying to be fair to her. But she says it's really not a problem we can't solve because through government tax policy and controlling government spending, we can keep that inflation in check. Now,
that sounds like that's worked out through history really well.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. If you actually really believe that government is able to control their spending, and if you actually really believe that government's able to, in an enlightened fashion, set the tax policy to make sure that there's no inflation, then, I'll sell you a bridge in Brooklyn, right? I mean, the history of government behavior is that they are going to overspend and they are going to print too much.
No doubt. So the incentive system is just broken. There's no accountability there.
There's just no accountability. Yeah. There's no stopgap. So so if we go to what she proposes that we do, this very stimulative, run deficits, print the money to pay for them, maybe a universal basic income, reduce income taxes, whatever it might be. If we go to that system, that will accelerate the demise of our currency and to worthlessness. I mean, I believe the dollar is creeping towards worthlessness rather consistently. We've seen that. Lost 98.5% of its value since 71.
Yeah.
The last 2.5%, we're on the way to losing that. But my point is, if after the Trump administration, if the other team wins, which would be horrible, but if they do win, there's a chance that they will print money like crazy, hand out UBI, run with a Kelton-like program, and that will truly destroy the currency. I mean, and to be completely transparent about it, I mean, this woman is taken seriously. I mean, she was an advisor. She was an economic advisor to Bernie Sanders.
That doesn't shock me one bit.
Right. And Bernie Sanders is talking about running for president.
Yeah.
So, this is not as far-fetched as one might imagine, that this kind of thing is being talked about.
I think she was on a Peter McCormick episode maybe.
Oh, I don't know.
A year or two ago.
Is that right?
I could be wrong.
Boy, I'd be interested if that's true. I'd be surprised.
I think he did have her on just to so he could debate or
hear the other side.
Hear the other side.
Oh, if that's the case, I want to see it.
Yeah, I think I listened to it and I just I couldn't believe it. I was like, listen to this lady talk. I was like, has she just not studied history whatsoever? I mean, does she?
Well, yeah, look, I get the theory.
Yeah.
She's right. If you can always print money, you can't run out of money. But she's wrong. I mean, what she's missing is that money can have zero value if nobody trusts it.
No doubt. This brings us to the Austrian School of Economics, which you and I are both believers in and practitioners of. You introduced this idea that value is subjective, right? Not intrinsic, meaning that
market
the market will determine and decide, and that can change on a daily basis. There's all this information that flows through the economy. And I think I did a book series with Aaron Van Weerdum on his book, the Genesis book, talking about the economic theories and ideas and, technology projects that led up to Bitcoin, the creation of Bitcoin, the computer science. But the very first chapter, we talked a lot about the Austrian School, and he talked about this concept called the spontaneous order. Have you heard that term before?
I've heard the term. I don't entirely know what it means, but I have heard the term.
So spontaneous order, the concept is closely associated with Friedrich Hayek and Adam Smith, but basically he said, he famously defined spontaneous order as the result of human actions, not of human design, highlighting that such order is not deliberately constructed, but evolves from the aggregate behavior of individuals. Adam's idea is very similar to the invisible hand,
right?
Kind of thing that's happening. But it basically says, you can't centrally plan all these things, right? Prices are sending all these signals, and people's preferences change on a daily basis. And it's this idea of subjective value, it's why we don't want to interfere with the pricing mechanism in society, because you're interfering with the very signals that will determine things, right?
Yeah.
It's
the market does a better job than any human ever could.
You're 100% right. 100% right. And there's the concept of the theory of marginal utility in setting prices. So unlike his predecessors, so what really separates the classical economics from the Austrian school, it was, Menger basically saying that an item's value depended not on the labor required to produce it, but rather its value exists in the minds of the consumer, right?
Right.
So you use the bottle of water as an example in the desert. So really interesting to really unpack all that. Let's see here. There's another idea that I think is powerful that I want to find, but I'm trying to remember the name of it. The Austrian business cycle, that's important to talk about. So von Mises talks about when banks artificially expand credit, they create new money, pushing interest rates below their natural levels. This in turn sends the wrong signals and leads to malinvestment, which we spoke about. So Friedrich Hayek and Murray Rothbard both also advocated for sound money and limited government intervention. So his, let's see here, Hayek. Yeah, so Hayek was a really interesting story about how he fled Austria and how he actually was in World War I. And he kind of watched how socialism spread kind of after that.
And he'd seen hyperinflation.
Yeah,
they lived through it. Yeah, right. They lived through it.
So I guess he had won they finally gave him the 1974 Nobel Prize in Economics.
Kind of amazing, actually.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah, that an Austrian actually won it.
Yeah, they said we gotta appear like we're fair here. We're gonna give it to But incredible by him, 1974. So the Austrian school rests on core truths. Money must be honest, and banking must have boundaries. That's a crazy idea.
Right, yeah.
We're to even utter
we're so far away from
we are so far away from that reality.
It's
like, we're conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, that's like old-fashioned stupid stuff. I mean, if you do that, you're going to ruin the economy.
It's wild. It's wild.
That's what they've told us. They're wrong, but that's what they've told us.
Yeah. But I mean, it's very clear when you examine history and you look back and study history. I mean, any rational person who looks at all this and studies it it's so clear that the Austrian the Austrian school of thought
it predicts what's
has the right
happen.
Predictive model, right?
Absolutely.
And nothing is perfect, right? So like I said, some
any model,
all models are wrong, but some are useful. And
yes,
this is by far the most useful.
Much more useful.
Yeah, exactly. I love this quote from I think it was Robert Auerbach's book. He goes, he basically said, the Fed hasn't just influenced economic thought, it has purchased it outright. It really shows you the broken incentive structure with this, the cesspool of government and money printing, and just it's so broken. And at the same time, they keep pumping up these cycles and blowing up the bubbles. It's wild. Yeah.
Well, and I think we kind of passed the chapter on the Fed, but I think it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Fed spends a lot of time and money lobbying Congress, and spreading around the propaganda that they're politically independent. And, I mean, and I'm like Yellen's comment, like when Honig was making the criticism of the Fed, Yellen said, this criticism is not helpful at a time when we can ill afford it. Do you know what I mean? And the point being, I think they know what they're doing is wrong, But they also realize that to continue doing it, they have to create this illusion and lobby, all the congressmen and senators and everybody else. They can't have the world turn negative on the Fed.
There's no independent thought. I mean,
Right.
you pointed out here, the people deciding what qualifies as acceptable economic research are themselves on the Fed's payroll.
Yes.
So, as economist Rob Johnson puts it, they're using taxpayer money to wrap their arms around anybody that is a critic and therefore muffle or silence the debate.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to get your PhD in the United States on monetary things and you're an Austrian economist, good luck.
Yeah.
Because part of getting a PhD is having your work published in the monetary journals.
Yeah.
The monetary journals are all Keynesians because they're getting money from the Fed.
Of course. It's
So it's
broken.
It's just broken.
It's perverse.
Yeah. So no Austrians ever get listened to.
Yeah. Murray Rothbard presciently warned, to achieve a regime of big government and government control, power elites cannot achieve their goal of privilege through statism without the vital legitimizing support of the supposedly disinterested experts in the professoriate. To achieve the Leviathan state, interests seeking special privilege and intellectuals offering scholarship and ideology must work hand in hand.
That's exactly what happens.
Wow. The Fed has turned economic scholarship into an intellectual protection racket.
Isn't that great? My editor actually suggested that sentence. She's really great.
Yeah, that's a great.
Mel Schilling. I should add.
You're gonna have to put that quote. You're gonna have to edit it and put quotations and put Mel Schilling.
I should
put it in the book. That'd be classic.
Yeah, because she's really fantastic. She helped me a lot on this whole book.
Yeah. The Austrian school isn't ignored because it's wrong. It's ignored because it's dangerous.
Right.
It's dangerous to the Fed's power, to government expansion, and to the comforting illusions of mainstream economics. When you understand this, the Austrian school's marginalization isn't just explained. It's predicted by their own model of how power and money corrupt institutions.
Correct.
Wow. This will take us to Stein's law.
Yeah.
If something cannot go on forever, it will end.
So Herbert Stein was an economic advisor. I think he ran the Council of Economic Advisors for President Nixon in the 70s. And he coined this great law. It's the one thing he remains famous for. And it's a pretty simple law. It's kind of a tautology. It's obvious. But if something cannot go on forever, it will end. And the tricky part about this whole thing and about fiat currency and about the monetary system that we've got and GDP growing slower than the debt is that we don't know when it'll end. But we do know, and it's funny, we just passed the weekend where Warren Buffett, who just retired, actually he cited Stein's law at his annual meeting, which
Did he really? Wow.
Yeah, and I put that in Twitter post and that was not on my bingo card for this year. And he was alluding to the fact that this, and to be frank, also Jay Powell, Fed chairman, has cited Stein's law. He's like, the fiscal situation that the United States is in, where we are spending more than we bring in and financing it using debt, is not sustainable in the long run.
Yeah.
And that's just another way of saying Stein's law. So, my natural reaction to that was, okay, Jay, what are you going to do about it? Because, the Congress is all hopped up on drugs and you're the drug dealer. I mean, by giving them cheap money, you're letting them do it. Whereas if you made the money, properly priced and more expensive, they wouldn't be able to get away with it. Right.
Mm. I mean, he did hike the cycle
he did
the fastest ever.
Yes, that's correct. But the minute when the 10-year went through 5%, he panicked and they started talking about cuts.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
This chart you have here at the beginning, which is the U.S. national GDP and all sector debt. I mean, if you look at it from 1947, from 1947 to 1971, like the two lines are identical to each other. They don't even diverge at all. They don't move.
Yeah.
But then once you hit 1971. You see the plane.
What happened in 1971?
Yeah, what the fuck happened in 1971? The plane just has liftoff, right? You just see the actual GDP just kind of stays flatter, and then the actual debt just explodes, and that the difference between the two is ever growing. I mean, it's
well, and that's the way compound math works.
Yeah.
I mean, if you grow a series at say 8% a year, which I think the debt has grown. Excuse me, I think at roughly 8% a year since 71.
Yeah.
Eventually the line starts to go very vertical.
Yeah. It seems like it. I mean, if you look at this, it really seems like it's already hitting that point.
It's very close to that point.
Yeah. Very troubling.
So, that's the underlying problem. But we also see Stein's law in a few other areas. Government spending is going up, right? With COVID, we had an enormous burst in government spending. And the way that we financed that, and we didn't cut it back after COVID, The way that we financed that was to issue debt, and that debt caused interest to spike. So if you go to the book on page 171, what you see is that the U.S. federal budget interest expense has gone from a period where not that long ago was in the $400 billion or a year range. It's now running at like a $1.2 trillion rate. And that's part of what creates what we're going to talk about here, which is what I call a death doom loop, where the government, runs deficits and uses bonds to finance those deficits. They sell the bonds into the bond market, which is of a fixed size, because in order, supply and demand in the bond market, there are only so many buyers. The buyers, in order to absorb them, need a higher interest rate. Well, okay, fine. That higher interest rate flows back into the government deficit. The deficit gets bigger. And if you can see where I'm going here, it's a reflexive circle where bigger deficit, more bonds sold, higher interest rate, bigger deficit.
Yeah.
And this is really what I define as a sovereign debt crisis. And this is not that unusual, Maddie, if you look at other countries done this in the past. What's unusual here is that this is happening in the country with the world's reserve currency, the biggest country.
Yeah.
So, Zimbabwe did this, Weimar Germany did this, Brazil's done it, Argentina's done it, Venezuela's done it. There are other countries that have had very high inflations or this kind of an emerging, currency crisis. It's just that they haven't really occurred in the biggest country in the world before, ever. But if you, as I say, if you pursue emerging currency policies or emerging country policies and mismanage your debt and your expenses, you're going to get the same result. It doesn't matter. It takes longer because we have the privilege of being the biggest country with the
exorbitant privilege.
Yeah, with the reserve currency, but it's still going to happen. Yeah. Mathematically, it pretty much has to happen.
Yeah. We've reached a point where the marginal value of each additional dollar of debt decreases over time, and eventually new debt is needed just to support old debt. This is a classic credit bubble, as defined by Austrian economists. Von Mises had it right when he cautioned, credit expansion can bring about a temporary boom, but such a fictitious prosperity must end in a general depression of trade, a slump.
Yep.
And then you point out
bubbles always burst.
Yeah, you point out three different scenarios here, right? The one is the hard stop, right? Halt debt growth and let GDP catch up. LOL. That's my response to that.
That's not going to happen.
Unlikely and very recessionary is what you said. Number two, the crash. Allow debt to default. Possible, but a depression result. See 1929. Or number three, the inflation solution.
Inflate your way out.
Print money faster than debt grows.
Right.
A temporary fix with long-term high inflation consequences. So
correct.
I think it's inevitable.
That's the way we're going. We just don't know when and at what rate. That's the only issue. But we are going to have a big print.
Yeah. Hopefully we can maybe not do number one, but maybe we can do not a hard stop, but start to structurally.
As we talked about during lunch, what we would ideally do is inflation would get higher, start to solve the debt to GDP problem.
Yeah.
Eventually, politicians would recognize that inflation is the problem, and we would ultimately do a monetary reset.
Yeah.
To sound money. That's what I advocate for. And there's as you know, there's a chapter in the book that talks about what my policy recommendations are.
Yeah. We'll definitely
we'll get there. Yeah.
I'm going to read one more Thomas Jefferson quote. I love these by the old founding fathers. Thank you so much for putting these in the book because it's just great to read about. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered.
Yeah, that's a great quote. And it really is the risk, right? It's the banks have taken control of the place.
We're seeing it. Look at the gap of wealth inequality. Yeah. I think it's playing out exactly the way Thomas Jefferson outlined it.
And it's really tragic. When you consider what a large portion of this country is going through in terms of the pain that inflation is causing them, it's really quite tragic.
Yeah. Stein's law is a reality check. Our current path of exponential debt growth must eventually meet its logical conclusion. The real question isn't whether this ends, but how we choose to handle the inevitable correction. Which takes us to chapter 16, which is a famous, I think Lynn Alden quoted this, nothing stops this train. And you use that as the...
For those who don't know, Lynn Alden is a brilliant economist, absolutely brilliant economist who writes an investment newsletter and also is very active in the sphere and the Bitcoin world. Yeah. She's a big supporter of Bitcoin. She also owns gold for what it's worth. But she's pointed out, and I agree with her, that this is what I described a little bit earlier, which is that we are in this debt doom loop, and it's extremely hard to get out of these. Extremely hard. I mean, there's no easy way out. As we just described, there are several different paths, but a collapse would be awful. And the inflate your way out isn't going to be pleasant either. But the ultimate way out is to reset.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're going. That's what has to happen.
I think part of what's so insane is that we talk here about just the out of control spending, right? Like before COVID and after COVID is like, it's almost like two different worlds. And even after COVID ended, the spending has not returned to normal. There was all this supposed spending that was like, I don't know what's happening in Congress right now between the Senate and between the House of Representatives. I keep hearing that maybe they're going to cut, but they just never do. So have you been following that closely in the past week or two?
I really haven't. I mean, because I kind of know how it's going to end. They're going to increase the debt ceiling, and they're probably not going to cut very much. I mean, So if you go to page 170 in the book, because I think this is a very interesting chart. I mean, pre-COVID, the government looks like we were spending roughly $4.4 trillion a year. COVID was an emergency. I get it. So expenses went up a great deal. They went from 4.4 trillion to a peak just below 7 trillion in annual expenditures. That's big. I mean, it's huge. It's like a 45% increase, right?
Yeah.
And that's fine. You're in crisis conditions. You have to take crisis steps.
We've seen that in the wars, right? But then afterwards, what you get is you get a return to reality.
Exactly. Earlier, we talked about how after World War II, they cut government spending 75% because we're no longer fighting a war.
And we had one of the best economies ever after that.
Exactly, right? But here we are, and we went up, and COVID ended. COVID's now in the rearview mirror, and yet expenses stayed at the same level.
Are you sure? I mean, I still see people wearing masks in airports all over the place. It's kind of like, I guess, in their head, COVID never ended.
For them, they did. For a few people, it didn't. But for most of us, it ended.
I think you're right.
And the fact of the matter is that we are still spending at COVID levels. So, and this is, I think what, many people have said this, that, there's no temporary government program, right?
Yeah.
you do a government program, it gets bigger.
No temporary tax, no temporary government program.
Yeah, and so sadly, this has contributed to the problem. I mean, we should have post-COVID, we should have dropped the expenses back down to where they were pre-COVID.
Yeah,
and our problem wouldn't be so acute right now. So, I mean, and this goes to the fundamental core of the problem. And I think it was actually Benjamin Franklin who said something along the lines of, this democracy will last until the people realize that they can vote themselves funds out of the public purse. And because why is the spending where it is? Because it buys votes.
Yeah, no doubt.
The Democrats particularly, through
I think it was von Mises and Hayek. They really saw this and said, hey, this is the flaws with Keynesian economics is that.
Yeah, that these guys will spend too much money in order to try and buy votes.
Yeah.
And it wrecks the public purse, and then ultimately the public purse gets wrecked and the currency gets wrecked.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, the governments throughout history, right, have just shown over and over again that if they have control over a fiat currency, they are going to abuse that. You are going to have inflation, and they are going to print. I mean, there's really, they haven't shown.
It's the incentives. I mean, if you look at the incentives, when you're in government, you don't really have the incentive to do the right thing. You should, but you don't. What you have the incentive to do is to continue being in office, and get yourself reelected and keep your party in power. And the best way to do that is to use the public purse to give goodies to the people who are going to vote for you.
Yeah, bribes, essentially.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like with kids, right? If you give them candy, they're going to love you, even though it's terrible for them, right? Like, they're going to love.
They want more.
They're going to love Uncle Larry who comes with the candy, and the mom says, "No, Uncle Larry, they got to eat vegetables and they got to have some protein."
And they want more.
Yeah, exactly.
They always want more.
This is kind of striking. To put things into perspective, the U.S. federal debt has just crossed 36 trillion. We've added 11 trillion in just 4 years. An amount that previously took over 220 years to accumulate.
Right.
It's remarkable.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it? And what it really shows you is the power of compounding. When you grow something at a compound rate, eventually the numbers get really large.
When you look at the next page, or you look at the chart of this, I think it's on for you. It's on the same page for me. I've got I think it was on the previous page for you, but I've got the manuscript here, so I've got all the.
Yeah, which one is it?
It's the staggering pace of new debt. Should be the bottom one.
Yeah.
I mean, what's going on in 1971? It's like everything was flat, and then all of a sudden, it's just like it just goes up. like literally parabolic, like a Bitcoin price chart. Like, it's crazy.
It's going off
Something funky must have happened in 1970.
71 was a big event.
Yeah. It's just, I guess one day the all these famous PhDs and all of these Keynesian educated Fed workers, maybe they'll do a study on this and
maybe they'll think about it. Yeah.
Maybe they'll look at this chart and just say, since 1800 this thing was flat, and then in 1971 it just went like this.
Yeah.
Exactly. Man, that's unbelievable. So you annotated this one and said that look at what happened right before the 2024 election. No doubt the incumbent administration pulled out all of the stops in an attempt to win the election, which failed. Right. In just 3 weeks of October 2024, debt grew by $460 billion, a pace that would add $7.8 trillion in a year if sustained. Stunning.
Yeah.
So the Keynesians tried everything.
They tried very hard to have the Republican or Democrats win the election.
But it's crazy because the people just they felt it. They just knew it was bullshit. Like they just
maybe
people just saw through it.
Yeah, I think more importantly, there was a certain remnant within America that understood that the problem was with the government, and so they voted for a change.
Yeah. So, and again, I know we've touched on this a little bit, but the important thing to point out is that every time we've seen countries essentially reach this level of debt growth, there's always a currency crisis. I mean, this is not the exception to the rule. This is the rule. It's like this almost always happens, right?
So, that's a few pages later on page 176 on my book. This is the study. I think I referenced it earlier. Originally done by was it Hirschman?
It's not picking you up.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a study. Yeah, it was done by Hirschman Capital that shows that in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Like 12 cases where governments got to this level of debt to GDP, and in every single case we saw a crisis in terms of either currency debasement, currency collapse, or depression.
You mentioned this idea of a debt doom loop. Why don't we dive into this and kind of talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, I mentioned that a little bit earlier. I mean, the issue really is just that as they spend more money, the bond market pushes interest rates higher. Higher interest rates cause a larger deficit. The larger deficit has to be financed with bonds. More bonds go into the marketplace, and interest rates go higher still. And so it's a reflexive, self-reinforcing circle.
I just got a text from Stephanie Kelton. She said that we could just print more money. What do you think, Larry? What do you think about that, Larry?
Well, she's right, and we will. The problem associated with that text and that policy choice is that the money won't hold its value. And so we will have more money, but gasoline instead of being $4 will be $12.
Yeah, I think the last time we've seen a currency crisis in the world's reserve currency was when the Roman Empire failed.
I think that's right.
Wow.
Yeah.
The printing press can delay the fallout, but it is a double-edged sword. Confidence wavers, and as Gresham's law explains, bad money drives out the good. More on this later. We won't go too deep into Gresham's law because we're going to talk about it in a later chapter, but Brian Hirschman did the study here, and I think 130% was that kind of crisis.
That's
and
the threshold level. Yeah,
essentially,
we're about 122 or
124 right now. Well, who knows? Since you published the book, we might be at 28.
It's going up.
So hearing like the segment notes, I wanted to ask you about this. You kind of said you admire Ray Dalio and a lot of his work on this, but you actually disagree with his thesis that policy makers can create a beautiful deleveraging if they are skillful enough. Has your mind changed on that? Are you still
No, it really hasn't, because I mean I don't know what Ray was thinking when he wrote that, because the problem is so acute and so well developed that to just kind of I think he thinks we can gradually balance the budget, bring debt back down, grow GDP, and we can have this kind of beautiful deleveraging scenario. And my belief is that we're too far down the road for that to occur, that we need to have a currency reset, that to try and do it slowly just won't get it done, and that we're too far gone. So I disagree with him on that. I mean, I agree with him on many of the other points he makes, though.
Yeah. What the fuck do I know? I'm like 30-something years old, and I would say I think probably that 130% mark that Brian Hirschman said, I would say, I feel like this is kind of like our last chance for that to happen, like in any meaningful way. So I think if he is right, it has to happen.
It's not impossible. I mean, what Ray is describing is not impossible. I mean, as you pointed out, I mean, AI and other productivity enhancements could help a great deal.
Yeah.
But it, at least in my estimation, it's not. It's going to be tough.
Yeah, I think this is the kind of the last. It really feels existential. This presidency with people like Elon Musk and with Doge and with Scott Bessent trying to refinance the debt.
If Doge really cuts a lot of expenses, I mean, they can put a dent in it.
Yeah.
Really slow it down. But as Lynn says, the train is running hard.
Yeah, the train's running hard. I mean, nothing stops this train. I would, I think we're right there. So it's either they stop the train now or
forget about it.
Yeah. And then you have all these countries here. It's really interesting. And this is just in the past, 150, 200 years. But again, there's another 100 countries on this list.
Many hyperinflations.
Yeah.
These are all fairly well known, fairly well developed countries, and that's why I think Hirschman chose them. You can look at banana republics have done this all the time.
And I think you have an important note here where you kind of say rapidly increasing interest burden that the U.S. government is incurring. In the past, low rates allowed the government to expand debt without immediate pain. Now at higher rates, the cost of servicing the ever-growing debt increases rapidly. Today, the U.S. spends over $1 trillion annually on interest payments, more than the military budget.
Isn't that something?
That is insane.
It is insane. Well, that's the other thing that ZERP did. When they took interest rates down to zero, it really allowed the government to mask how much these deficits were creating a problem because they could refinance at low rates.
Yeah.
Right. But now that, it turned into, I mean, they had this disinflation issue, they had deflation going on, so they could get away with it. Well, when COVID came along and they printed direct money and we had a real inflationary burst, suddenly that free lunch was gone.
What's funny is that I do remember this from Trump's first administration. Do you remember him talking about this? He said he wanted to issue like a 100-year bond and refinance the debt when it was super.
It was actually Mnuchin, his Treasury Secretary, said that. And
I can't believe they didn't do that.
There was no demand. They tried.
They did try.
Oh yeah.
Okay. I thought
he tested the water. No, he tested the water for 50 and 100-year bonds.
Wow.
And to be honest with you now, I mean, part of the reason why, Yellen is more recently, and this isn't in the book as much, but, a lot of the debt U.S. federal government debt has been shifted into the into short-term bills. And the reason for that is that the marketplace is telling, the Treasury Secretary, we don't want this 10 and 20 and 30-year paper.
We want to see what you guys do now.
Yeah. I mean, we know there's inflation risk.
Yeah.
And I think that's why Yellen made the last Treasury Secretary before Bessent, she made the conscious decision to use the front end of the curve, i.e. to finance the government debt in 3 months, 6 month, 1-year paper. And by the way, that's what emerging countries with debt crises do too, because nobody trusts that the debt will be money good over a longer period of time.
She passed off a fucking terrible situation.
Oh, she did. Yeah. I mean, this year, Bessent has got to refinance between $7 and $9 trillion of short-term bills.
Yeah. I've been following Ray Dalio. I mean, he said, if you don't own gold, you know neither history nor economics. But I've actually been watching him over the past, 5 to 6 to 7 years, watching his take on Bitcoin evolve and change.
Isn't that something?
I've enjoyed that.
He's a smart guy.
Yeah.
And he understands the value of gold, and he understands sound money, and he understands cycles. He's written books about it. And so, he's a very smart guy, and he started off quite skeptical of Bitcoin, and now I think he fully embraces it. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think reading this, looking at the data, this is why Bessent right now is, they're trying to engineer this thing to refinance a lot of this debt and get these rates down. I mean, they really need to. It's existential, right?
It really is.
And how do you think it's going to play out? Do you think Powell is going to bring them down eventually? I mean, it almost feels like it's destiny. Like he has to do it, or else,
Yeah. So and this is just a guess. My guess, Powell he admires Volcker. He believes he's a company man. He's a man of the system. He's a statist. And my guess is that he does not want to go down in history as the person who let inflation come back into America in a big way. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, I think he's going to err on the side of being too tight for too long. And I think he's only going to cut if he's absolutely forced to cut. Yeah. And by absolutely forced, I mean what we described earlier, which is the Treasury market becomes discontinuous, or we have some kind of a financial crisis. And in that point in time, he will have the event and the event cover to say, well, look, I'm an inflation hawk, but the bond market was failing and we were having serious trouble here and XYZ was collapsing. I had to bail it out. I had to do what Bernanke did. And so, and then to take this even a step further, there's some of us who think that maybe Besant is intentionally trying to force his hand.
That's what it seems like.
Yeah, as we know, Trump has said rates are too high and they should come down. And actually, if you look at it objectively and arguably, they should come down. I mean, the Fed funds rate should generally track the 2-year. I mean, Jeff Gundlach has said that. And right now, the 2-year is significantly below the Fed funds rate. The Fed funds rate is too high by 75 basis points. And so,
I mean, if you're looking at those inflation statistics too, like
if you believe in trueflation, et cetera. So,
what are your thoughts on trueflation? Do you think it's?
I don't believe it.
You don't believe it?
I don't believe it. I do believe inflation is coming down in some areas, but not in others, and it's mixed. I mean, look, if we get a really slow economy, certainly housing inflation will slow down. But meanwhile, auto insurance is going up a lot. I mean, there are always a lot of moving pieces in the inflation numbers. But back to your original question of how do I think this will play out? My sense is that sometime within the next year, the financial markets will break. That, we've already seen the indications that that's coming in the last Fed meeting, which there's one going on today, but in the one before today, the Fed reduced their quantitative tightening. They were reducing their balance sheet at $25 billion per month. They cut that down to $5 billion.
Okay.
That's an easing step. Okay.
Yeah, they're slowing the pace. They're
slowing the pace of offloading the debt of the balance sheet. More recently, Besant has been using Treasury General Fund account to buy bonds to support the bond market. They've talked about maybe giving swap lines to the hedge funds who are involved in the basis trade, who are buying a lot of debt. They've talked about trying to amp up the stable coins so that the stable coins will get larger because the stable coin companies are large buyers of government debt. I'm quite sure, or I imagine it to be the case, that when Trump and Besant are out there trying to negotiate these new tariffs, that they're also saying to the people like Japan and others, this is great. We can help you out on the tariffs. How about you help us out by buying more debt? Or maybe we term this out and make it longer term. So to me, things are getting tight, and all it takes is an accident in the stock market, which I think might be in the process of occurring because we had a big down when Trump announced the tariffs. All it
Things
takes
have kind of come up a little bit since then.
They've recovered, but we'll see if this is real or not. They haven't recovered all the way to the old-time high. Basically things are going to get financially dicey, and Powell's going to be forced to print again.
I love this quote by Richard Russell.
Oh, he's a great guy.
Inflate or die. So, I mean, obviously the premise of the book is they're going to print this. They're going to print money to keep the system going. I mean, it's inevitable, right? I mean, we know it's coming. I guess in your newsletter, you're saying that we've been referring to this event as the big print, a monetary expansion that will dwarf the COVID era stimulus, potentially ballooning the Fed's balance sheet from $7.1 trillion to an unprecedented 20 plus trillion. The inflation this will unleash will be devastating. All roads lead to inflation. Paul Tudor Jones. And
I mean, we're not the only ones who've seen this. I mean, Warren Buffett talked about it just this last weekend. I mean, they need to get the value of the dollar down as compared to currencies that can't be debased. And so the debt needs to be debased in real terms.
Paul Tudor Jones said, Bitcoin is the fastest horse in the monetary debasement race. Yeah. I think he's come around as well in the past couple of years. Totally.
And he's a very, very smart hedge fund manager, self-made billionaire from investing.
You wrote this, given these choices, history suggests they'll choose inflation every time. The only question is how devastating that inflation will be.
Right.
I think it was your, Luke Groman. I think.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I think he was on a podcast talking about how they're going to. I can't remember which one. It was a really good one.
Revalue gold. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of revalue certain things. And
Natalie, he did one.
This was maybe like 6 months ago, 3 months ago. I can't remember. It was like 2 hours. It was really good. Really good. All this is just fascinating. Tell me what an accident chain is. Because I thought this was cool. You're a pilot, so
most pilots know this. So my dad was a pilot. I was a pilot. Still I'm a pilot, but I don't fly much anymore. When you're flying, they say that it's not the first problem that'll kill you. It's like when you get yourself into the corner where you got a lot of problems and your degrees of freedom, go down. And a perfect example is, if you're flying an airplane in good weather with plenty of fuel, you know where you're going, you got no problems. Well, okay, suddenly you don't have enough fuel because you misplanned. And then suddenly the weather gets harder. And then maybe you have to divert to another airport. Well, now not having enough fuel is a problem. And then you've got to land, maybe you lose an engine. And so now you've got a twin engine plane, but you're flying single engine, which is hard to do. And this is an accident chain. You want to have as much redundancy in planning a flight so that you increase the odds that you can safely complete the flight. And it's not necessarily the first thing that goes wrong. The fact that you're low on fuel. Well, if the weather's good, your engines are running, you know where you're going, and you've got plenty of fuel to make it to that destination, you're fine. But what happens when the weather gets bad? Well, okay, now it really matters that you didn't have enough fuel to begin with because you got to divert. And so the point is, as a pilot, you try not to put yourself in a position where one thing goes wrong, then another thing goes wrong, then another thing goes wrong. And then pretty soon you feel like you don't have many alternatives. You're trying to do something that's very difficult, and it can lead to an accident.
In your notes here, I thought this doesn't have anything to do with economics, but I thought it was really interesting. I remember JFK Jr. in July of 1999. I remember being like a little kid, and I was with my family. We were in Lake George, New York on vacation, and just had this little old TV that was like, in the log cabin.
Yeah, the next morning, right?
That was all that was being played on TV. I just remember the talk of it. They couldn't find it. It was gone. But you said that, you flew the exact same route from New Jersey to Chatham 2 hours earlier that evening.
Yeah. I knew exactly what happened.
Wild.
It was wild. Yeah, it was eerie. I woke up that morning. It was a nice, beautiful Saturday morning, very sunny. I was in Chatham. I woke up, I turned on the TV. My wife said, "Hey, JFK's flight is missing. He crashed." And they showed that he had left New Jersey and was going to Martha's Vineyard. And they showed where he went off the radar screen where they couldn't see him anymore. And I said, "Oh, I know what happened. He flew VFR into IFR conditions, visual flight rules into instrument flight rules conditions. And when that happens, if you're not trained as an instrument pilot, you get what they call spatial disorientation, just to say you don't know which way is up. It's really strange. So you're sitting in an airplane, and suddenly all the windows become white. So where's the horizon? When you're steering a plane, you know the horizon. Oh, I'm turning right. Oh, the horizon. You can see yourself moving against the horizon. When you take that away, you suddenly have to rely. You have an instrument that tells you where the horizon is, but you have to know how to read that instrument. You have to be trained to do that. And they've done experiments that show that an untrained pilot flying VFR into IFR conditions, within less than 3 minutes, they'll auger in. They'll crash the airplane.
No way.
Yeah, that happens. And it's probably the largest cause of small plane accidents are people without instrument ratings flying into bad weather.
That's a terrible situation.
It was terrible. It was very sad because he had his wife and her sister on board with him.
Oh, man. Gosh.
But I remember the night I flew, it was extremely foggy. And I think they were calling it marginal VFR, which is, truly marginal. And I had an IFR rating, so it wasn't hard for me at all. But I thought when they reported that it had happened, I knew exactly what had happened. I said, "Oh, I know what he did. He didn't know what he was doing. He hit clouds and he crashed."
Wow. What is an IFR rating? What does that mean? That means that
it's instrument flight rules rating. So you have to train for a very long time. And you fly around in an airplane with a hood over your eyes or with just some glasses that only let you see the instrument panel.
Wow.
And the instrument panel tells you which way is up. It tells you when you're turning. It tells you when you're climbing. And you learn to trust those instruments because they will tell you the truth. And seat of the pants, the problem is it happens subtly. You may be in a turn, you may be in a climb, you may be in a dive. And normally that would feed through, you'd feel it by the pressure on the seat. But it fools you. You don't really know.
Wow.
And the instruments tell you the truth.
Wow. Poor economic policy decisions stretch back decades, each one reducing his degrees of freedom. Now, like a pilot with one shot at a carrier landing in stormy seas, Powell must attempt an almost impossible feat: land this fiscal and monetary behemoth without crashing the system.
Yeah.
Our monetary system is in trouble. It is just math.
Yeah, it's true. It's kind of sad. I don't particularly like Jay Powell because I think he's a lawyer and I don't think he's qualified to do what he's doing.
Yeah.
And I think he gaslights us on a lot of issues. But I will say this, he's in a terrible position.
Yeah.
And I feel sorry for him in that respect. This is just a mess. And like I say, I've said in other places, I don't think God himself could fix this.
It's definitely a tall tale, or a tall task.
Yeah.
I think
he's got a real problem. I'm sure what he's hoping, his term expires early next year. And if I were I'd be sitting there thinking, "Oh my, just
please don't reappoint me. Please don't reappoint."
Well, no, he won't be reappointed. He doesn't want to be.
Yeah.
If he were, he wouldn't take it. I'm sure. In fact, I'm not sure he could be. But he's just hoping that he can get out of here before the problem arises.
Yeah. Who do you think they're going to appoint if it's not him?
I don't know. They've been talking about this guy Kevin Warner, I believe it is.
Kevin Warner.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Warner's the right one. Kevin Warsh.
Kevin Warsh.
who used to be a Fed governor. He's friendly with Besant. He's friendly with Trump.
Okay.
He tends to be a bit more he leans a bit more Austrian sound money.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm not sure he's exactly where we are, but I think he understands the issues better than most. So he'd be one possibility. Another possibility would be Judy Shelton, who's the gold standard woman.
They're not going to let her. Let her through.
No, they didn't. They didn't last time, but Trump might be able to prevail this time. And Trump did appoint her once before. Wow. Of course, she was overwhelmingly defeated by the Keynesians and the lobbying efforts of people in Congress. But
yeah, I think this is a good point to leave off.
Okay, sounds great.